Hello and welcome. I'm Steve Scully, a contributing editor at The Hill, and thank you for joining us for our program titled Reimagining the Pharma Supply Chain. In today's program, we will talk about drug shortages and the strains on the pharmaceutical supply chains. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Pfizer, for supporting today's important conversation. The pandemic has exposed our country's dependence on other countries for essential prescription drugs. This threatens the security of the supply chain, and it leads to shortages of essential prescription drugs like amoxicillin and Adderall. So how do we ensure our healthcare manufacturing practices and supply chains are sustainable? Hello and welcome. I'm Steve Scully, a contributing editor at The Hill, and thank you for joining us for our program titled Reimagining the Pharma Supply Chain. In today's program, we will talk about drug shortages and the strains on the pharmaceutical supply chains. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Pfizer, for supporting today's important conversation. The pandemic has exposed our country's dependence on other countries for essential prescription drugs. This threatens the security of the supply chain, and it leads to shortages of essential prescription drugs like amoxicillin and Adderall. So how do we ensure our healthcare manufacturing practices and supply chains are sustainable and able to reach the demand? What did we learn from the manufacturing infrastructure around COVID and the COVID-19 vaccine? Is the supply chain crisis a wake-up call to transform, to reimagine, and to rebuild new pharma supply chain models? Our program today hopes to answer those questions and much more. Now, you can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag #TheHillSupplyChain. My first guest is Congressman Buddy Carter. He is a pharmacist for over 30 years. Congressman Carter is also co-sponsor of the Made in America Act. This is legislation that works to mitigate drug shortages while incentivizing the domestic manufacturing of drugs. Congressman, thank you for being with us, and I want to begin on one of the looming questions that we have been talking about, which is why so many pharmaceutical supplies are coming from foreign countries.
Well, over the years, first of all, let me say that I think that there's a big difference between knowing something and realizing something. We've always known that this was a problem, that too many of our pharmaceuticals are coming from other countries, but we realized it during the pandemic. And we realized that what happened was that a lot of the pharmaceutical manufacturers, for numerous reasons, not the least of which was labor costs, moved their manufacturing facilities overseas. And we experienced that during the pandemic. We experienced it in a number of ways because we had a shortage in medications. And not only medications, but also PPE and also a number of different things related to the pandemic. In fact, the ASPR, the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Emergency Response, he told us in the Doctors Caucus that in the fall of 2019, they noticed a downtick in the amount of PPE that was coming from China. Now, we didn't even know about the pandemic until the spring or February of 2020. They knew what was going on then, and they started withholding the amount of PPE that they were sending to us. That should send a strong message to us right there of the importance of having either our manufacturing taking place here in America, or at least having our allies have the ability to manufacture prescription drugs so that we are not held hostage by our adversaries and depend on them for our PPE, for our pharmaceuticals, and for the things that we're going to need during a pandemic.
You come to this conversation really with two different but important perspectives, as a lawmaker, a member of Congress, but also as the owner of your own pharmacy for 3+ decades. So wearing that hat, what did you learn over the years? What were your biggest frustrations, and how do you apply that to Congress today?
Well, what I learned during that time, of course, was that we often had supply chain issues. Now, there were supply chain issues, and in fact, you can go to today. We're having a problem with amoxicillin, and it's not necessarily the manufacturing of the drug and it being manufactured overseas, but We've had an increase in RSV. We've had an increase in the number of ear infections during this time. And that has caught the pharmaceutical manufacturers off guard, and they're not prepared for it. Therefore, we're having a shortage of that. That's why I've introduced legislation to deal with this. Two pieces of legislation. First of all, again, what we experienced during the pandemic was the supply chain issues and a shortage of certain medications. What we need to do is to complement and supplement the federal stockpiles by encouraging the states to have their own stockpiles. That's why I've introduced legislation, the State Stockpile Readiness Act, that will have grants that will match dollar for states that actually have their own and generate their own stockpiles. Also, we need to include the private sector to make sure that they are helping us. That's why I've got another piece of legislation, the Essential Medicine Stockpile Act, that will help these and encourage the manufacturers to use the private sector to have these stockpiles, particularly of generic drugs, so that if we do have a problem like we're experiencing right now in the amoxicillin, that we can address that problem.
I'm curious, though, 2.5, almost 3 years into this COVID-19 pandemic, it really did show some of the divisions and the weaknesses that we have in our supply chain. So what did we learn about that, and how do you apply those lessons moving forward?
What we learned, first of all, if you'll take, for example, China and India, those two countries are where most of the pharmaceuticals come from right now. India withheld 26 drugs, 26 essential drugs during the pandemic that we could have used, but they were hoarding those drugs in order to make sure they had them for their country. Now, nobody can really blame them for that, but at the same time, that puts us in a predicament where we don't have access to those drugs. That's why I've introduced the Made in America Act. And what that does is it stands for manufacturing active pharmaceutical ingredients, drugs, and excipients in America. And what we're trying to do is to repatronize those companies, those pharmaceutical manufacturers, to come back to America using the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the opportunity zones that we created in that act, using that will give them a 30% incentive, a 30% tax credit. In order, if they use the opportunity zones where you have the federal poverty level is at 30% or more, then they can use that and they can actually get the discount. That's going to be incentive for them to bring manufacturing back to America. And that's what we need. You know, it's bad enough that we weren't prepared during this pandemic, but shame on us if we're not prepared the next time, because we've learned some important lessons during this pandemic.
Because that is something that we are hearing from health officials, public health experts, is that there will be another type of pandemic. We just don't know if and when that happens. Can you, though, point to states that are doing it right, this public-private partnership that involves the federal government, but also state tax credits?
Well, again, this is a pilot project that we're starting with the State Stockpile Act. But even in my home state of Georgia, we've done this before. I remember when I was in the state legislature and we had the outbreak of the bird flu, we actually encouraged a stockpile of certain antibiotics in case that we had more of an outbreak of the bird flu. And we were prepared for that. So there have been some states that have utilized this and have made preparation in order to be prepared and in order to have a stockpile so that if something does happen, then they're ready for it. They can respond to it.
And as you look at some of these issues, we're now in the cold and flu season. A lot of these drugs are respiratory illness medications, and there is a real severe shortage of these drugs. Why?
Well, again, I think it's just a lack of preparedness, and that's why we've got to stress it, and that's why we've got to encourage these states and the manufacturers. This needs to be a private-public partnership here. We need to work with the manufacturers, with the private sector, to make sure that we are prepared and that we have an ample supply in order to address this situation. I can only imagine a parent not being able to get an antibiotic for their child. That would be awful because it's not available. That's why we've got to be better prepared, and that's why I've introduced these pieces of legislation that will encourage these stockpiles and also encourage us to be able to manufacture those drugs here so that we're not dependent on, especially adversarial countries, for our pharmaceutical needs or for our PPE needs.
So as the now former owner of Carter's Pharmacy, but when customers came into your drugstore asking for these very specific medications, you didn't have them. How did you explain it to them?
Well, it's difficult to explain. First of all, we made every effort that we could to find it for them, calling other pharmacies and seeing where we could help them with that. And then, the next option that you have is to look for something else that might not be as effective, but hopefully will help. And we were able to handle most situations, but it is a very uneasy feeling to tell a parent of a child that you don't have access to medications in the most advanced country in the world. And that's just inexcusable, to be quite honest with you.
And I'm curious, what's the role of some of these large manufacturing chains? How are they involved in some of these supply chain issues that we've been talking about?
Well, they have a big role, and that brings up a great point, and that's a great question that you've asked here, because what we are finding out, particularly on the Energy and Commerce Committee, on the Health Subcommittee, is that we're not having a whole lot of research and development in certain sectors of, in certain areas, if you will, of medicine. For instance, in antibiotics, because it's not very profitable now for pharmaceutical manufacturers to invest in the antibiotics. We're not seeing a lot of new antibiotics come to market. We've got to address that in Congress, and we've got to encourage these companies or incentivize them to invest in these areas that we need them to invest in too, such as antibiotics. They all want to look at other areas, and that's great. We want them to be looking at where it's more profitable. Look, it's a capitalist system, and they're looking to make profit, and we understand that. But we can't be caught with our pants down, if you will, and not have the antibiotics available for when the next big bug comes out.
You mentioned international cooperation. India is soon to become the world's most populous nation. We've had issues with China, a rather lengthy meeting in November between President Biden and Xi Jinping to try to foster that cooperation. On this specific area, whether it's India, China, or other countries, how are we doing that, and where can we do better?
Well, where we can do better is to have more manufacturing here in America. We used to have quite a few pharmaceutical manufacturers in Puerto Rico, but because of some problems over there, they left Puerto Rico, went over to Europe. And again, not the least of which is labor and the price of labor. But we've got to make sure that we are creating a fertile environment for pharmaceutical manufacturers to invest in America and to manufacture in America. And we got to, and that to me is the role of government. We have to create an environment in which these companies want to be in America. And that's what our responsibility is.
So why is that so hard? Is this simply about profits for the drug manufacturers? Why is it hard to make these drugs here in the U.S.?
Well, it's certainly not hard as far as having the facilities or the knowledge and the ability to do it, but it is a market-driven market, and it's and the incentive is profit, and if they can be more profitable overseas, then obviously they're going to move overseas. These are companies that are practicing capitalism, so we've got to be more competitive. That's why, again, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the opportunity zones that were created in that's a real good opportunity for these companies to take advantage. And it's win-win for all of us because it'll be investing in areas here in America we need them to invest in, where they have low poverty rates, and then we'll be incentivizing them with a less tax rate and a tax benefit.
Congressman Carter, is this one of those issues that really cuts across partisan lines? Are you getting Democratic support?
Absolutely. In fact, we've started a caucus that is addressing this, and it's extremely important. Listen, I tell people all the time, I practiced pharmacy for almost 40 years, and I never had an opportunity or never had a situation, I should say, where I went to the counter and I said, are you a Republican or a Democrat? I mean, it was just, my child's sick or I need this medication. Partisan politics has nothing to do with this. That's why we are working in a bipartisan fashion to address this. Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent, if you need that medication, you need that medication. It needs to be available for you.
And so final point, as you look at this Made in America Act, what are your metrics of success? If we were to talk a year or 2 years from now, what would you point to?
I would look at it as how dependent are we on foreign countries as opposed to, at that time, as opposed to where we are now. We know that, 80% of all the antibiotics are coming from overseas. 80% of the ibuprofen is coming from overseas. Well, if we can change that and reverse that course, and we've got more manufacturing here in America, then we'll know that we've been successful.
And the biggest supply chain concerns you have are what?
One of the biggest supply chain issues that and concerns that I have is with the APIs, the active pharmaceutical ingredients, because this is the base formulation, if you will, that you need in order to make these drugs. And if we don't have the active pharmaceutical ingredients in order to formulate these drugs, in order to compound these drugs, then we're going to be in trouble. So that's one area that we really need to concentrate on, is to have more of the APIs manufactured here in America.
And how will this issue play out, final question, in the new Congress? Republicans will have control of the House, Democrats will have control of the Senate. What are you looking at?
Well, we are working, as I say, in a bipartisan fashion with the new caucus that we have put together, and we're working together on that. I'm not certain that it's as much of an issue that's dependent on Republican, Democrat, who's in charge, as much as it is the important lessons that we have learned during the pandemic. And us coming together, and as we do oversight on what did we do right, what did we do wrong, what did we learn during the pandemic, as we start to address those questions, then we work together to address that and come up with solutions.
Congressman Buddy Carter is a co-sponsor of the Made in America Act. He's also a former pharmacist, a member of Congress from Georgia, and a member of a couple of key committees looking into this legislation, supporting this bill. Congressman, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Congressman Carter. And Democratic Congressman Darren Soto of Florida is also a co-sponsor of the Made in America drug legislation. I spoke with him recently. Let's listen. Congressman Soto, thank you for joining us. And we have been talking during the course of this conversation on some of the very real and serious shortages of drugs in this country, in part because of supply chain issues. And I'm curious, from your standpoint, how do we fix that?
Well, we saw during the height of the pandemic that we were woefully inadequate in our capacity for pharmaceuticals, especially both antivirals and eventually to be able to manufacture the vaccines that ultimately helped us get out of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we have the Made in America Act. It's a bipartisan act with Representative Buddy Carter and myself. Both of us are members of the Energy and Commerce Committee. And of course, we are focusing quite a bit on that in the committee. It would provide 25 to 30% tax incentives to boost more domestic manufacturing so that we're not shipping drugs all the way across from the Pacific or from the Atlantic, so that we're sourcing more raw materials here. It's about capacity. Certainly we'll still be importing pharmaceuticals going forward, but we have to build back our capacity, much like we're doing with the CHIPS Act, telecommunications, and other sensitive sectors of the U.S. economy.
So let me follow up on 2 points. First of all, are those tax incentives enough for U.S. drug makers to come back to the U.S. and to get to a level or a point that you're satisfied with? How long will that take?
Well, first, it'll be about our existing manufacturers boosting up their capacity or keeping lines of production open. That was a big issue, that there were lines that were closed during the pandemic that had to be reopened because you have to maintain them. And of course, some of that will be recruitment of new companies, but we're just trying to increase the capacity, and that remains still an open question that we'll have to be reviewing in committee because the bill hasn't been heard yet in committee, and it's something that I just spoke with Representative Carter today on, and it's something that we're going to continue to push going forward. We did see some discussion on it generally in the Energy and Commerce Committee, but these are questions we'll continue to ask. Will this go far enough?
And Congressman Carter are also part of this conversation, but let me go back to the issue of U.S. drug makers who are shipping or manufacturing some of their supplies in foreign countries, well over 100. China has about 13 to 15% of drugs that come from China to the U.S. Why such a disparity?
Well, I think we allowed through the total free market without having incentives for domestic production, just the natural exodus of U.S. manufacturing in the pharmaceutical area. We saw that in vehicles until we maintained trade in a better way. We are seeing that in microchips. But yes, right now, 72% of our pharmaceuticals are imported, 13% from China. And of course, they're an economic rival of ours. We've had issues with tainted products coming from there now and again. And we certainly don't want to be beholden to them. It's a different level when we're talking about importing from allies like Europe, Korea, Japan, and other allies across the globe. But it does put us in a vulnerable spot since they're not super transparent on how they do things. If something goes wrong, we learned that during COVID. And certainly we don't want to have to go try to investigate if there's a contamination of that 13% of pharmaceuticals coming from China. So this, again, is margins of improvement to increase capacity. It won't absolutely eliminate that, but it'll improve our own independent ability to handle both pandemics and shortage of drugs in the country.
But you use, Congressman, the word that we never want to hear, vulnerable, especially for a superpower like the U.S. So in the short term, what are your biggest concerns when it comes to these drugs and the shortage of drugs that impact so many Americans?
Well, certainly as a superpower, we have to recognize where we need to improve upon things rather than ignore them. And that's why Buddy Carter and I are taking this bull by the horns. We can, in the budget, in the meantime, improve funding for purchasing and for our national stockpiles as ways to do that. If the Congress would pass, particularly the Senate, the COVID supplemental that we've been asked by President Biden to pass, that would also continue to make sure there's a lot of funding in capacity, particularly for respiratory issues, which is one of the areas where there are shortages. So there's a couple things we could do in the short term as we're looking to more structural change in the long term. For the CHIPS Act, it took years to get domestic incentives to bring semiconductors back to the United States. It's something that we're slowly starting to see. So we know that something like a 25 to 30% tax incentive, depending on whether it's an economic opportunity zone and whether it's a high poverty area, then you get a bump in that. That is going to take a little while to get something ambitious like this done.
When you say take a little while, have you given any thought or any insight in terms of how long it would take? Are we talking 5 years, 10 years, perhaps even shorter? What is your time frame?
Well, we filed the bill this year, did not get the bill out of committee just yet. We're going to be working on it in the 118th Congress. So my hope is we could get it done in the next term, since it would be unlikely a bill that hadn't been heard and passed out of committee could get into the upcoming omnibus at the end of the year. In the meantime, there have been short-term incentives in this area through the American Rescue Plan. So it's not like no work has been done on it. We really had to boost up our capacity to ramp up the production of both the vaccine, COVID tests, and other pharmaceutical resources. So there has been a ramp up, but we don't want to be caught flat-footed again like we saw in 2020 when the pandemic hit our shores.
But it is bipartisan, as you mentioned, Congressman Carter, a conservative Republican from Georgia. So do you expect this to have a fairly easy glide path in the next Congress?
Whenever you're talking about large sums of taxpayer money to help incentivize industry, there's always going to be rigorous debate, as there should be. Like with the CHIPS Act, it's a similar concept. So I think there's going to be a lot of interest in it. And we will both be pushing this in the 118th Congress. Whether or not it passes, we have a lot of explaining and defending this to our peers, but we all went through the pandemic together. We saw the shortages. We saw that we could have seen it far worse if we weren't well funded, but we can't rely on these major pandemic packages every now and again. We need a more consistent capacity so that these lines of production for everything from masks to pharmaceuticals to the raw materials, all these different things, we have a better domestic capacity overall for anything that comes our way.
And where's the White House? Where is the president on the Made in America Act?
Well, we have not heard a particular statement from President Biden, but I know he has been a champion of boosting domestic production and rebuilding our country. That's what the infrastructure law was all about. That's what the CHIPS Act was all about. And with the combating climate provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act, he's been a big fan of that too. And we do know he's been aggressive in boosting American industries vis-a-vis China. And so we think he'll be supportive of it. And it's something we'll be engaging our White House liaison about.
And let me conclude with one final point, because it seems to me this is an area that would be relatively easy for Congress to put pressure on the FDA, and that is speeding up the process of some of these new drugs. I know it's an issue or a component of this debate that you have been part of. I wonder if you can address that.
Well, a lot of that we conduct through oversight. We and the Energy and Commerce Committee have oversight over FDA. And often if we'll hear companies, there's delay that is inexplicable, we'll inquire. We also believe in an independent FDA that can make the right decisions for public health. So it is a careful balance on how we speed up certain drugs. Of course, if it's an emergency, we could push for a waiver. But again, I still want to make sure as we're in emergency situations, potentially speeding up, for instance, the vaccine to get it out in an emergency, that the science still governs at the end of the day whether a drug gets approved. So it is a give and take between the Congress and the FDA as far as how expeditious these drug approvals will be.
Representing Florida's 9th Congressional District and committee assignments, including the House Commerce Committee, Congressman Soto, thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Steve.
It is now time for the sponsor perspective session of the program. Jason Jedlinsky is general manager of The Hill, and he sat down this morning with Mike McDermott, the chief global supply officer and executive vice president of Pfizer. But first, a short video from Pfizer.
For many industries, the future of manufacturing and distribution looks uncertain. But at Pfizer Global Supply, we see it differently. Amidst global crises, we're doubling down, pivoting, and innovating more than ever before, laying new groundwork, expanding capabilities. Because sometimes the only way forward is through. To us, a supply chain revolution is the only response, driving innovation in manufacturing and distribution to get medicines to the people who need them most. It's not easy, but we've always known what we're capable of. The resilience, flexibility, and talent of our people shines even brighter when the world goes dark. We're not on the other side yet, but we'll keep pushing until we get there. Because breakthroughs that change patients' lives can't wait.
Joining us now is Mike McDermott, Chief Global Supply Officer for Pfizer. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, let's dive right into the theme of the program, Reimagining the Pharma Supply Chain. Why is that so critical?
Look, if you think about supply chains on everybody's minds these
With more on those supply chain issues and specifically how they impact the distribution of drugs and pharmaceutical supplies, we turn our attention to Jay Timmons.
For many industries,
Delivery of that solution.
Yeah, so you think about the pandemic and sort of everybody was struggling, right? Supply chains were struggling, in some cases downright failing around the world. And the pharmaceutical industry, I think, was really there. It was really a proud moment for us to make this impact on public health. And For Pfizer, if you think about when that started, it was March of 2020 when we partnered with BioNTech to think, could we imagine a COVID vaccine that was not only safe and effective, but we could produce billions of doses? I mean, that was kind of the notion. And then could we do it at light speed? Could we do a process that takes up to 10 years to launch a vaccine? Could we do it in 9 months? And then even more so, how could we make billions of doses, which ultimately led to us doing a 15x improvement in our pre-pandemic vaccine production to post-pandemic. So yeah, to say it was an amazingly stressful but innovative time would be an understatement. But I think the impact has been great. The numbers today were 4 billion doses distributed to 181 countries around the world. And I think what's excitingly and most important is equity has always been on our minds. So 1.6 billion of those doses went to 112 low and middle income countries. So it really was a global effort that impacted patients around the world.
Were there some firsts for Pfizer in there, some things that you'd never done before?
Yeah, there were definitely some firsts in there, which was amazing. While we have a really very deep technical platforms across biologics and vaccines and small molecules, we had never launched an mRNA vaccine before. So that focus around how to scale up mRNA in particular was a focus for us. And then while we have cold chain expertise, we've never done -80 cold chain at scale. And so that was definitely new for us.
It seems like a distant memory, and it was only 3 years ago that we were all talking about those shipments.
That's right.
What are some of the major lessons learned that you and the industry are taking away from this experience?
Yeah, so if I think about the lessons learned, certainly for Pfizer and then the industry, for Pfizer, it's been really around our speed. I talked about a light speed culture. How can you really cut the bureaucracy and drive solutions and give colleagues a chance to just go, to just take everything out of their way and just let them innovate and drive. I also think science, of course, we talked about mRNA technology and the partnership we have with BioNTech really made an impact there. So there's a speed scale. And the scale piece for me is what really blew me away, was our 37 internal plants, 30,000 colleagues, hundreds of contract manufacturers, and thousands of individual companies came together to really make this impact. So when I think about what that could mean for the industry, for sure, those partnerships are going to be key going forward. And then for sure, it's going to be important for us, like here in the US, to ensure that we have a favorable environment, right, for our innovations. And in particularly right now, making sure that the Made in America Act is passed so that our FDA can be funded to do their great work.
If you think back to that moment when you had to disrupt all those operations and all those plants, it's one of those, not can we, but how will we do it? What's something that surprised you from that experience?
Yeah, I think the most surprising thing was the ability to just innovate at speed. And actually that constraints actually helped us, right? Because if we had no constraints, if there was no time factor to this, we could have been ideating this forever. But the fact that we had a public health crisis, the fact that we had to really focus. And then, of course, we had a wonderful CEO that said, money's not going to be the issue and just work it out. I think that was really empowering to colleagues. And that's what kind of blew me away in the whole experience. It's a bit like me growing up. My dad was in NASA. He worked on the Apollo program. And I always imagined what that was like for him. I watched it as a kid, but for him as a professional. And I kind of always wondered, would I have that experience in my life? And sure enough, launching the COVID vaccine was definitely a bit like putting a human on the moon.
That's a great full circle family story there.
Indeed, yeah.
As you think of pandemics yet to come, unfortunately, we know COVID-19 won't be the last, and we know the nature of public health going forward. What are some of the enduring lessons you think that are going to be critical to follow in the future?
Yeah, I think for sure for Pfizer, what we really embraced during this was, again, light speed culture. For sure, we embraced by way digital. I mean, the digital tools that we had to use and embrace during this process were really groundbreaking and made such an impact, particularly in our cold chain technology, really made an impact there. And I think the other piece that really inspired me during it was the focus on equity. I talked earlier about getting the vaccine to patients. And we thought, well, how could we reimagine the supply chain? How could we get to that last mile in some places where to think of this cold chain, how could it possibly be? And so we ended up designing the cold chain solution that could be -80 for 30 days without a plug anywhere, right? Just to be able to innovate to make sure this product can get to everywhere it needs. We partnered with Zipline to find ways to actually use their drones. They hadn't done it before for vaccines, so we worked for that technology and gave it to them to use for any manufacturer to be able to help patients in needs in the most remote villages. And then I think really the work that Pfizer did recently in announcing our Accord for a Healthier World. I mean, what a groundbreaking initiative to take all of our innovative patented medicines and provide them at a non-for-profit price to 45 lower-income countries that covers up to 1.2 billion people in the world. So this notion of scale and equity, not just during the pandemic, but for the future, is what really excites me and inspires me.
It sounds like there's a number of those innovations that are really here to stay and will be a part of your even sort of non-emergent supply chain for Pfizer going forward.
They will indeed. We'll embrace all of this going forward and ensure that the technology we built around mRNA, the speed that we built, the cold chain capability, use all of that for future pandemics, if hopefully we never have one, but certainly for future innovations.
As you talked about the scale of the manufacturing and distribution process, the partnerships like Zipline that you got creative with, people has been a key theme, much like your dad's heritage with the Apollo program. Tell me about how Pfizer's thinking about the future of work and the future of the workforce and how that plays into the supply chain.
Yeah, this piece excites me so much. Again, to have an opportunity to see our colleagues like bring their best to work and be so innovative and be so passionate about serving patients, particularly in a pandemic, is what blew me away. So if I think about this workforce, how do we maintain that going forward? I mean, certainly there's a gap we know in U.S. manufacturing just across all industries. So we need to do our best to keep STEM education going, to really ensure that we're educating the future workforce, expose them to our industry, which is really exciting. Like I had the opportunity as a summer intern while I was in university. It's the reason that I'm in pharmaceuticals today. So those things are really compelling. But I also think for me is embracing diversity and equity and inclusion has been a critical part of our success, because we know that when we bring people together from all walks of life, they actually produce better outcomes, right, than those are from similar walks of life. So that has been extraordinary for me. And probably the most exciting example that we've had recently is our work we've done on our refugee leadership initiative. So this year we hired 100 refugees from Afghanistan, Syria, and those colleagues are now working in our manufacturing sites, making an enormous impact and filling a labor gap that we had, right? So critical jobs, they're highly educated, great opportunity to fill a gap for us and a great opportunity for them and their families. So it's been so successful, actually 100 refugees this year. We've signed up for 500 more over the next 5 years, and something that I think will be our legacy for many years to come.
Well, congratulations. That sounds like a terrific initiative.
Thank you.
As you think about parents whose daughters are looking at the heroic role that medicine and doctors and drug makers had during this pandemic, what would be a piece of advice you'd give them? You talked about the importance of STEM education and starting early for those aspiring chemists and formularies out there. What would you say?
Yeah, as the father of 5 daughters, all in university today, I could tell you that we're really passionate about them really immersing themselves and choosing the careers that they really love and enjoy. 3 of my daughters are studying STEM degrees, and one in marketing, one in history, and I'm excited for all of them because they will all make an impact on the world. And I think what we try and highlight with them is that their career paths are going to be very different, that the road won't be very clear, it won't be a straight path. But if they have the confidence, if they work hard, if they embrace the great technology and the great diversity around them, they can make wonderful things happen in their careers.
Well, that's inspiring and a great thought. To close, I wanted to ask you, if you had to pick one thing we could do as an industry or as a country to better prepare for the next pandemic, what would you single out?
Yeah, we definitely signal out partnerships. So partnership across industries, partnerships across companies, really the flexibility as well that's needed within a pandemic. And then, of course, lastly, we need an environment in the U.S. where manufacturers, like pharmaceutical manufacturers, can do their work in an environment that is effective, that is welcoming, that allows us to utilize our capital and hire and really make an impact. And I think particularly we need our country to be much more firmer on intellectual property. It's urgent that the work that we do, the innovations that we develop in the U.S. are not forced upon other countries to be given away, when the innovations we're here in the U.S., the innovations are really making an impact on public health, and we don't want those jobs lost and that capital investment lost to another location. So IP protection would be one, I think, incredibly important. But ultimately, with the right partnerships, private industry and the public, we can really make an impact going forward.
Well, thank you. I expect that IP protection is part of your agenda over on the Hill as you head towards an afternoon of meetings, but thank you for joining us. Mike McDermott, Chief Global Supply Officer for Pfizer. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.
With more on those supply chain issues and specifically how they impact the distribution of drugs and pharmaceutical supplies, we turn our attention to Jay Timmons. He is the president and CEO of the National Association of Manufacturers here in Washington, D.C. He is also the chairman of the board of the Manufacturing Institute. Mr. Timmons, thank you for being with us. I want to begin with COVID-19 as we now approach almost 3 years since this pandemic first came to the international attention. But when it comes to supply chain issues in general, what did we learn about the supply chain and the weak links that we've seen over the last couple of years?
Well, I think we learned exactly that, Steve, that we did have some weak links that needed to be repaired. And manufacturers, because manufacturers are all about solutions and solving problems, I think have shown great progress in repairing those weak links over the past few years. It is hard to believe it's been 3 years since the pandemic started. And I think the other thing that is frankly remarkable, and I don't care who you talked to 3 years ago at the beginning of, or the onset of the shutdown and the pandemic, nobody would have ever predicted how resilient, incredibly resilient manufacturing would be during that time, really shattering expectations across the United States. And so I think what we see here is a really unique opportunity to not only preserve the gains that we've made over the past few years, but also to really strengthen the sector more than we probably thought possible pre-pandemic.
But let's talk about some of the challenges that you and the 12 million men and women that you represent every single day. We're seeing higher energy prices, inflation is on the rise, and a real challenge in the workforce. So how has that complicated the plan to kind of move out of this pandemic and to a more normal system of distributing supplies in general and drugs in particular?
I'm going to make a small edit to that question because it's almost 13 million people now who are working in the sector. And in fact, that's the most in manufacturing since November of 2008. But to your point, we do have labor shortages in the sector, just like every other sector of the economy. But we have 800,000 open jobs on average every month over the past, I guess, year and a half in the sector. And so that does put pressure on manufacturers. If demand continues to remain strong, which we see it remaining fairly strong, you just don't have enough people to make the goods to respond to the demand. So when your supply's tight, what does that do? That leads to higher inflation. Higher inflation, obviously, or also the other problem that is created is it does create shortages in the supply chain. So all of those things kind of feed onto each other. But I do believe we're coming through that. We're coming through it fairly remarkably, especially in the last few months. We've seen reports that show perhaps the pace of inflation is slowing and the supply chains are starting to unfreeze, and that's all good news for us. But one of the things that we have to do is we have to make sure that we protect some of the policies that allowed us to stay resilient through this very difficult period that we just experienced. And I would say that the number one thing that manufacturers believe we need to protect and perhaps even strengthen are the tax reforms that we were able to get into place in 2017. Those have helped us invest and hire and grow wages and benefits here in this country.
So let me go back to your earlier point about some of the good news, and this may play into what you just mentioned a moment ago about incentives, tax incentives and others. But generally speaking, how do you either reinvent or reimagine America's supply chain in this post-COVID environment?
Well, look, I run the National Association of Manufacturers in the United States. If I had my druthers, everything in the world would be manufactured in the United States. But look, that's not practical. It's not realistic. So I think the question becomes, what do we need to do as a nation? What do our policies need to reflect in terms of trying to prioritize and incentivize manufacturing investment and job creation here? We've done a couple of really good things. In a bipartisan way, we passed the infrastructure bill last year. This year, we passed the CHIPS and Science Act. Those were two huge steps forward because they did incentivize parts of the manufacturing economy or made it easier for to handle the logistical needs of manufacturers. Now we need to look at some other areas of policy and policymakers, the newly elected Congress is going to have to tackle some issues related, for instance, to trade. They're going to have to make sure that we're not overreaching on the regulatory side of things. And those are, I think, key objectives for policymakers, whether they're in Congress or the administration moving forward. Don't harm the good progress that we've made. Allow us to invest here in the United States and hire more American workers, and hopefully incentivize and train workers moving forward so that we are able to attract more folks into the sector.
And I realize this next question is pretty basic with a lot of complex issues around it, but why don't we make more in this country? What more can we do? What should we do?
I actually think we make a lot in this country. I think that is a bit of a misperception. There are things, obviously, just think of face masks for one, that we didn't make here in the United States during the pandemic or pre-pandemic. And we discovered that we need to, we need to make sure that we're supplying our healthcare needs here in this country. That was something that really wasn't a priority for us in the past. And I think it's going to be moving forward. But if you think about all the things that are made that you use every single day, so much of that is either made here or made with component parts that are made here, or the finished product is made here. So we still have the largest manufacturing economy in the world, and I don't expect that to change anytime soon. But we have to make sure, I'm going to go back, and I know it sounds a little repetitious, we have to make sure that we don't harm ourselves moving forward. I use an example when it comes to pharmaceuticals, for instance. The TRIPS waiver that is being implemented or negotiated and implemented at the World Health Organization, that's going to give away our intellectual property. And if we give away our intellectual property, while, by the way, at the same time, not renewing our research and development tax credit, that is going to erode our ability to create that next great innovation that would either make the world a better place to live or, in some cases, like a pandemic, save the world. So we've got to make sure that we're taking care of business here, and that includes protecting intellectual property. It means making sure that our tax rates are the most competitive in the world, and that our regulatory system is performing in a way that enables us to solve the world's problems without penalizing manufacturers that are doing exactly that.
But clearly, as you mentioned, the CHIPS Act is designed to bring many of those manufacturers back to the U.S., not from Taiwan or India or other countries. And we're seeing new plants, for example, in Ohio and in New York State. Where else will this lead it? And can we apply that to the pharmaceutical industry? Lessons learned from CHIPS to drug manufacturers.
Well, I tell you, one of the reasons that we had to move down kind of that path on CHIPS is because we allowed our nation's, frankly, superiority on semiconductor fabrication to leave this country. And the reason we did that was because of poor tax policies and regulatory policies that made it difficult to to make those important products that literally go into everything that we manufacture today, or that we have in our homes, or that we use in our offices or in our daily lives. We allowed that to go elsewhere. Part of that, also think about this, in order to make the semiconductor chip, you also need critical minerals. We've made it difficult to mine those minerals here in this country. That is also part of the CHIPS legislation, allowing us to actually produce those or to access those minerals that are so important to the production of semiconductor chips. So I think that the lesson learned here is don't do things that harm parts of our economy or harm parts of the manufacturing economy and then have to do double duty to bring it back. Another example, I mentioned the research and development tax credit. We've let that expire. Hopefully we will see it come back later this year with tax extenders that will be debated in the lame duck session of Congress. But look at China. China provides a 200% tax deduction for research and development. So we've provided for the last several years a 100% deduction. We've already been lapped by China, and now we're letting this annual deduction expire. It makes no sense. So first I would say do no harm. Don't allow things that are actually allowing us to succeed expire or change. Let's make sure that we protect those, and then let's look at some other opportunities to grow the sector.
So let me bring it back to the issue of drugs and pharmaceutical supplies and the simple concept of supply and demand. How do we make sure in this country that we have the supply that meets the demand?
Well, I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record here, Steve. I'm sorry. But I want to go back to the importance of incentivizing manufacturing investment here in this country. Those tax cuts in 2017 became, unfortunately, a political football. And there were some that wanted to make infrastructure investment and the CHIPS and Science Act a political football as well. Thankfully, we staved that off. I was really sorry that in 2017, the tax cuts became a purely partisan issue, because so many folks on both sides of the aisle would talk to me about the importance of investing here in this country. And they understood that our tax rates were some of the least competitive in the entire world at that time. So I think our challenge is to not allow ourselves to politicize our competitiveness or our ability to compete with other economies and other governments around the world. So that's number one. Let's make sure that we have the policies in place that allow our pharmaceutical companies to invest here in this country and to hire and to raise wages and benefits. Then secondly, let's make sure that we don't do anything to harm what I think is the gold standard for us in this country in terms of intellectual property protections. So again, the TRIPS waiver of IP protections for vaccines, including diagnostics and therapeutic products. We should not be giving away our intellectual property. I mean, we're fighting China tooth and nail to try to protect our intellectual property. I don't know why we would allow an expanded waiver when it would jeopardize innovations that are needed to fight not only COVID-19 and future pandemics, but also harm kind of current and future agreements that are aimed at boosting global production and voluntary technology sharing that we have in place right now.
Jay Timmons is the chairman of the board of the Manufacturing Institute, also the president and CEO of the National Association of Manufacturers here in Washington, D.C., an important voice in this conversation, especially with regard to the supply chain issues. Mr. Timmons, thank you for being with us.
Great to be here. Thank you, Steve.
And now for more about our domestic manufacturing capabilities and how to build resilience into the supply chain, I'm joined by a panel of experts. Our first two guests served on the National Academy's Committee on Security of America's Medical Product Supply Chain. Marta Wyszynska is a visiting fellow at the USC Brookings Schaefer Initiative on Health Policy at the Brookings Institution. She's also a healthcare economist. Erin Fox is a drug shortage expert. She's also the senior pharmacy director at the University of Utah, where they track current drug shortages. And John Murphy is the chief policy officer of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, also known as BIO. I spoke with all three of them this morning. Thank you all for joining us in this conversation. And John Murphy, I want to begin with you in terms of the shortage of drugs that we have seen. We've talked about the pandemic, which has really shown some of the pressure points when it comes to supply chain. But in many cases, it predates what we've seen in the pandemic in 2019 and 2020. And in some cases, the shortages are 7-8 years. My question is why?
Yeah, so there's a couple of factors, but why don't we talk specifically about the ones that we saw pre-pandemic? So you saw a number of shortages in sterile injectable products, sometimes low-cost generic drug products. And one of the reasons for that is because the product margins, a commercial sale got so low that in order to ensure consistent supply, companies had to consolidate production facilities. And as a result, they became very susceptible to events that could take them offline, that being an FDA inspection that triggered a shutdown and a refiling. You had a good example of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico several years ago, which effectively knocked offline almost all of the sterile injectable production that serviced the United States because there was no way to shift production to other facilities. So we have atrophied not just the industry, but more broadly, the manufacturing sector in the United States, a lot of our supply chain resiliency. And it was highlighted very much to the American public during the pandemic. But you're right to point out, this is something FDA and the industry have been tracking and working to manage for several years under a couple of authorities that FDA has to get notified of shortages and to work with manufacturers to shift production. It is not something that has been alleviated by the pandemic, but I do think it has highlighted the need for us to explore some significant changes to the way supply chains are run here for the healthcare supply in the United States.
And Erin Fox, from your vantage point at the University of Utah as the senior pharmacy director, how does this impact the patients and their care? And do you have a sense that pharmaceutical companies have contingency plans if and when there are shortages?
You know, it's very frustrating from the provider's end here at our health system. We don't always know if our order will even arrive. We don't know what to expect. We rarely have information about how long a shortage is going to last. We do a lot of workarounds to make sure to minimize the patient impact, but all of that work is tremendously burdensome, time-consuming, and is getting extraordinarily difficult in the face of labor shortages.
And Marta Wazinska, as you look at this from Brookings and from a think tank standpoint, what should the FDA be doing more when it comes to some of these drugs that might be in the system but not yet readily available? Is there a process to speed it up to help alleviate some of the issues that we're dealing with today?
So FDA has been doing a lot. They really monitor the system as well as they can to the extent that they have the data. They have been trying to improve the access to data that they have so that they can monitor things. A particularly big vulnerability for them are some of the more recent shortages that have to do with demand increases. That's something that is really difficult for FDA to get insight into. So that's an area where FDA will need to continue finding ways to do things.
And let me just follow up on that with you, Marta, and ask about whether or not labor shortages are contributing to some of the problems that we're seeing today.
There have been situations where labor shortages have been an issue. Actually, probably the most the one that comes most to mind is actually Emergent with vaccine production. It wasn't exactly a labor shortage, but this is a manufacturer that was going to be manufacturing vaccines, and they just could not bring on staff that are they needed highly specialized staff, and they basically ended up having a mix-up. So this definitely was an example of a labor situation. Pandemic also created potential problems with labor, simply because so much of our supply was coming from China and India, and China had a big lockdown. So that's another vulnerability that's related to the supply chain.
And John Murphy, you're nodding your head. I want to talk about China and India because, yes, we are getting more drugs from those two countries. But is that a concern? Is that a problem for the U.S. and for our supply chain and for its customers?
So I think it's a concern in the respect that if they are the sole supplier, it leaves us vulnerable to disruptions, as Marta indicated, in situations where demand spikes or where a natural disaster, or in the case of COVID, for instance, you lost the ability to transport in the early stages of COVID, those raw materials to the production sites in Europe and the United States. So it is very much a concern where we don't have redundancies or at least resiliency and shifting plans in the supply chain. I think that's one of the things that Congress and the administration is looking to alleviate in their executive order on biomanufacturing and bioeconomy. Now, there are other U.S.-centric components of that, but underlying that is also to explore how we ensure that a pandemic event in the future that might cut off supply chains from one facility can be shifted and ramped up into other areas. It's very much a concern. India, another good example, locked themselves down and restricted exports to certain COVID therapeutic products early in the pandemic to serve their own needs. I suppose one could understand that from a nationalist standpoint, but them being the only supplier of things like propofol for ventilator access became a harbinger of problems to the rest of the world when that happened.
And Aaron Fox, my wife is a nurse at the largest hospital in Northern Virginia outside of Washington, D.C. She is dealing with some of these shortages. She talks about it on a regular basis. And my question is why? Why in the 21st century we're still dealing with even some basic drugs that patients need? And as John indicated, some of these hospitals have to make sure that they can ration that medication to make sure that they can treat their patients.
That's right. I think it actually comes back to something that John talked about, how, these are low cost drugs and there's very little resiliency. When one company makes a product and another company has a shortage, there really isn't room for another company to truly make up all the difference. And, we see this in the most basic of products, things like lidocaine, things like sterile water, even, it is very frustrating. And we also see medication errors and, nursing shortages are there. I'm sure your wife feels that. Pharmacy shortages are there as well. And so the amount of training and education to teach people how to use something different in hospitals is very time consuming and risky for patients. It would be much simpler to be able to purchase the products we need, but at the same time, the manufacturers just aren't stepping up. Certainly, I'm sure they're manufacturing what they can, or even manufacturing to their contracts, but clearly it's not enough. And as Marta pointed out, these supply spikes are also very difficult to manage.
And Marta Wazinski, as we heard just from Aaron earlier, it is a public-private issue. And so when you look at this from a public policy standpoint, what Congress has done, or maybe more importantly, needs to do in the next Congress, what are the priorities?
I think what's really important is to recognize the sheer size and complexity of the drug supply chain and the need to prioritize. We have thousands upon thousands of supply chains, 20,000 approved drug products in the US, 13,000 facilities that are registered, make API or finished dosage product, and we're not even talking about inactive ingredients. So this is also not something that companies can take on themselves. There are economic reasons why we have this problem. Just-in-time manufacturing is very much driven by economics. Going to outside of the United States to produce is another reason it's an economic reason. Making massive facilities so that the average cost of production is really, really low, that's another economic driver. To have a resilient supply chain in a sense, goes against sort of profit maximization. And so there's a huge role for government to either provide sticks or carrots and incentivize that, which takes me back again to prioritizing because it's so big. So I really do think that we should be going back and, for example, reassessing the essential product list, which I think is missing a lot of really key products that are important from a public health perspective. For example, we're not paying attention to inactive ingredients and where they're produced. We also need to be thinking about financial incentives and how to incentivize companies. So those are some of the things. So actually, just one more thing I was going to say, in terms of Congress, I think there's a huge role for Congress to really fund ASPR. ASPR is in an incredible position to be doing a lot of these assessments and and helping Congress figure out what they really should be investing in. We only have so much money to go around. This is going to be expensive. And so funding ASPR would be the very first thing that I would be recommending. If we're thinking about onshoring, we really should know what we should onshore. And we need better analytics for that first.
John Murphy, the word of this conversation continues to be resilient. So I'm going to go back and ask you to define exactly what that means. And also to that point, are these pharmaceutical companies doing enough to anticipate where there may be some of these shortages in order to be resilient?
Yeah, so I think, what does resilient mean? I think resilient in a perfect world means a situation where where the demand can facilitate an immediate shift in surge for that new demand. So you have the ability of a supply chain to pivot in a way that goes from cost of day-to-day production to move over to assess and take care of demand that is unexpected. So on the one hand, you have expected resiliency. You know that at some point you'll have to take a plant offline to do a thorough reboot or a thorough cleaning, and you can shift production. What we have heretofore done a fairly poor job of is anticipating how to respond to unanticipated demand in products or unanticipated shocks to the supply chain. There's a very important shortage of a medical product for pediatric tracheotomy tubes right now. The result of that is because there's a demand on silicone related to the upkeep of chips, microchips and other microprocessors. There's only a finite supply of silicone. And so we have to also have a resilient supply chain that prioritizes human health needs in the case of shortages. And that's why, going back to Marta's point, ASPR and the government have a key role to play here because they can help facilitate the movement of key supplies around where you have unexpected demand, where a microprocessing unit plant may have to be deprioritized because a healthcare unit plant needs to absorb new supply. And I think that is an area where public-private partnerships or the government does play a key role, because you cannot expect the commercial sector to deconflict these priorities all on their own. And then the other thing I'll say in terms of funding ASPR is also ensuring that we have a government that is backstopping supply. So we are not just creating a strategic national stockpile for the sake of saying we have it, but we are managing it in a way so that when we need to go to that stockpile in an unanticipated circumstance, things are not expired. The necessary medicines are prioritized in those stockpiles. And that creates an incentive for manufacturers to keep production online. It creates that backstop for the patient community when that's demand. And it again highlights the role of the government to help ensure that supply chain is resilient by being a purchaser and a facilitator in cases of unmet need.
Aaron Fox, I'm intrigued at how you're able to keep track of some of these shortages. You do so at the University of Utah. So quite simply, how do you do that? And from your standpoint as an educator, what have you learned, especially during this post-pandemic environment?
Sure. So we get reports about shortages from all over the country from health systems who can't access something. But we know that there are all kinds of reasons why that could be. So what we do is we contact the manufacturers directly to confirm if it's a shortage or not. Once we do that, we will post information. We also include information about alternatives and safety issues that can come up. We're really trying to focus on helping health systems get through a shortage. Ideally, that website wouldn't exist. I wouldn't be doing any of that work, and we would be able to order all of the medicines we need for our hospitals. But over time, what we've learned is that there is a lot of secrecy in the pharmaceutical supply chain. We often don't know a true reason for a shortage, and having a reason for a shortage helps us figure out how long is the shortage going to last. If the plant is completely shut down, that's a shortage that's going to last for a while, and we need to make very different plans for our patients compared to, hey, our shipment got stuck, it's coming in a week. That's a very different issue, but manufacturers don't really have to provide that information to us. So over the years, certainly have learned a lot about how many trade secrets exist and how little information we actually know about our medicines. In many cases, we don't even know the actual company that truly makes the product because of contract manufacturing.
Marta Wazinska, we talked earlier with John Murphy about the pre-pandemic shortages, but what have we learned during and since the pandemic? Where are the big pressure points? And from your standpoint, what are the lessons learned?
The pandemic resulted in a different set of shortages. Until the pandemic, the typical shortage was one for a generic drug, typically sterile injectable, and those were really resulting from supply disruptions and manufacturing quality problems in facilities. That's been sort of the typical type of a shortage. The pandemic brought to us incredible demand surges. That's been a major change and affecting not really necessarily just the low margin generics. In a sense, the problems to address one versus the other differ, right? To deal with this sort of sterile injectable manufacturing quality problems, you have to be worrying about manufacturing quality and how to address that. And this is not necessarily a technology solution, although it might be. For the demand increases, there's a need for us to figure out how to scale up manufacturing rapidly. And it's a different set of technologies. So we basically have seen a much broader set of issues that came for us to worry about.
I want each of you a final minute with a pretty broad question. Aaron Fox, I want to begin with you. What are either the challenges or the opportunities moving ahead, especially in your area as somebody who's on the front lines of pharmacies and pharmaceutical companies? Aaron Fox?
Well, I think a bright spot of COVID is the light that it's shown on supply chains. Before COVID, hardly anybody cared about this story. Very few people really thought about drug shortages. And so I think this is a great opportunity for government change and manufacturers to change. And hopefully we can add that resiliency back into our supply chains.
And Marta Wazinska, the same question to you, the biggest challenges, the biggest opportunities.
Probably about how we think about onshoring. There is incredible interest in onshoring. I've already spoken about prioritizing. We need to prioritize. But even if we decide which drugs, which pieces of supply chains do we onshore, we really need to be aware of the fact that just because we're bringing it onshore to the US doesn't mean that we're going to have a resilient supply chain. The vast majority of drug shortages that we have had so far were caused by manufacturing quality problems in US-based facilities. So assuring resilience and attaching strings to manufacturing quality for things that we onshore, not putting them in hurricane-prone areas, et cetera, is really critical. So we can't just simply onshore even just what's most important. We need to be smart about how we also onshore and what strings we attach to this.
Let me just follow up on that one point. So when it comes to these plants or distribution centers, you're telling the companies what?
So there are two ways to, one is, where you are going to locate facilities, right? If you're going to onshore them. Another thing could be that you potentially will require that they have contingency plans of a certain kind, right? That they have multiple suppliers if we're going to support you and onshore you. You might have to install particular type of technologies to make sure that it's more resilient. So perhaps, you put in continuous manufacturing. So there are a number of ways to basically say, yes, we're going to give you money, we're going to help you build a plant here, but we want to make sure that the plant is built in an area that's less vulnerable, and that it's built in a way that it's going to be much more resilient, and that you have backup plans in case something were to go wrong.
John Murphy, we will conclude with you, your final thought, challenges and or opportunities moving ahead.
So I think a brief challenge is to ensure that we don't get, to Marta's point, so subsumed by this idea of onshoring that we lose sight of the fact that in the healthcare side, patients and the industry is global. And so onshoring and creating a resilient supply chain just for the United States does not help the broader global population of sick individuals in the case of a pandemic or in the case of broader global health policy challenges. And so ensuring that our governments work together coming out of the pandemic and harnessing those things that they understood went right and those things that they understood went wrong to collaborate to ensure that we have sufficient operability of a supply chain globally so that patients in any one corner of the world aren't left in the dust when we inevitably face another global public health challenge in the future.
And we will face that, correct?
Yes, absolutely. It's a matter of time, not a question of if.
Each of you adding such an important perspective to this conversation. John Murphy is the Chief Operating Officer of BIO. We thank you for being with us. Marta Wazinska, who is a visiting fellow at the USC Brookings Schaefer Initiative on Health Policy, and Aaron Fox, Senior Pharmacy Director at the University of Utah. To all of you, we thank you.
Thank you.
And that brings us to an end of our program. A big thank you to Pfizer for its support and for all of the attendees for joining us in this important discussion. And for those of you who may have missed any of the conversation, video from the event will be up on our website shortly. I'm Steve Scully. Thanks for tuning in.